It was the moment everyone was waiting for, the moment when Pilate pronounced the sentence of death. It had taken 3 Jewish trials and 3 Roman trials, but eventually a verdict was reached. It was time for the official declaration, and so Pilate sat down on the judgment seat. It was called the stone pavement, in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It was Friday of the final week of Jesus. The Gospels refer to it as the day of preparation for the Passover Sabbath. That would be the next day. It would be a special celebration because the Sabbath fell on the Passover week. The Gospel of John says it was the 6th hour. Now, the way Jews reckon time, they start at sunrise, and for them the 6th hour would be noon. But John used the Roman style, the Western way of reckoning time. It's very similar to us. You start in the middle of the night, and the 6th hour is 6 a.m., sunrise. And thus the sun was rising over Jerusalem, even as a darkness was descending upon Jesus. Pilate gave the official order of execution. He handed Jesus over to the soldiers to be crucified. Now, every execution had to have an official criminal charge. And it was the custom of Roman leaders to make a sign that would identify the charge and then post that on the cross so anyone passing by could find out why this person was being killed. If a man had committed murder, he'd be identified as a murderer. He might even have his victims named. And so a sign was prepared for Jesus announcing his charges. The sign was written in 3 languages. First in Aramaic, that was the day-to-day language of the Jews. Second in Latin, that was the native language of the Romans. And then in Greek, because that was the universal language everyone could read. On the sign for Jesus, Pilate had these words written: Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Now he took those words from the chief priests and elders when they presented charges against Jesus. In one of their charges, they said he claims to be the King of the Jews. That puts him in opposition to the Roman emperor. And thus the official charge against Jesus will be treason against the state, treason against the Roman emperor. Now, of course, that was false. And everybody involved in the trials of Jesus knew that wasn't true. Pilate knew it. The Jewish leaders knew it. But Pilate has to have an official charge for an execution, and thus it will serve his purpose to identify this as the charge. Jesus was executed for treason. Now, the Jewish leaders, they protested, didn't like the way he wrote the sign. They said, oh no, don't say that Jesus was the King of the Jews. You need to say he claimed to be the King of the Jews. You're making us look bad. I suspect Pilate got a little bit of satisfaction out of annoying these fellows after all the trouble they had given him. And so he told them, what I've written, I have written. In other words, I'm not changing it. You're going to have to live with it, just like it is. The official charge against Jesus, treason against the state. Now, we associate the crucifixion of Christ with a lot of suffering, but the suffering actually began even before he was nailed to the cross. The suffering began first when he was in Jewish custody. Matthew chapter 26 tells us that as the Jews held him, their soldiers would abuse Jesus. We're told that they spit in his face. We're told they took their fist and they would slam his body with their fist. And then they would take their open hand and they would slap his face. Now that's 2 different ways of hitting a person. Each one inflicts its own kind of trauma on a body. In addition to that, they did all sorts of other things to not only abuse him, but to mock him. Mark tells us in chapter 14 that they blindfolded Jesus, and then they would hit him, and they taunted him. You're supposed to be a great prophet, so prophesy. Tell us which one hit you. And then, of course, they would laugh as Jesus stood there silent. He first was abused during his Jewish trials, and then handed over to Pilate. Now, in the trial before Pilate, Pilate came up with the scheme that if I punish Jesus severely, perhaps the Jews will be satisfied and they'll agree that we can release him. So Pilate had his soldiers give Jesus another beating. They also dressed him in a purple robe. They put a crown of thorns on his head, which would inflict a certain amount of pain, put a staff in his hand, and then they would kneel before him and say, "Hail, King Jesus." They'd take the staff and they would hit him on the head. All of this just making fun, but also inflicting pain. Eventually, he was brought out on stage in his beaten form. He had the crown of thorns on his head. He had the purple robe. Pilate pointed to him and said, "Behold the man. Take a good look. Are you satisfied?" Well, they were not satisfied. They wanted him crucified. When Pilate did issue the order of crucifixion, then he did what is typical done for someone being crucified. Matthew tells us it was time for the flogging. They took the whip and they would cut open the back of the person who's about to be nailed to the cross. Why? Because once they put him up against the cross and he hung there for hours, that would inflict even more pain as his open back was up against the cross. The suffering that we associate with the cross began even before the cross. It came time for the movement from the judgment to the crucifixion site. And we're told in John chapter 19 that Jesus went out. He was bearing his own cross to the place called Golgotha. Now, if you're imagining him carrying the full cross, as we sometimes do today in recreations, that serves its purpose for teaching us a lesson. But the Roman tradition was more along the lines of to carry the crossbeam. The crossbeam is what the arms would be attached to. And as you carried that to the place of execution, there would be the post that would be attached to as they would nail you to your cross. And so Jesus will carry his crossbeam. Now, he's been under so much abuse. He is so worn out that eventually he can't carry it. And thus a guy who just passing by, minding his own business, a man by the name of Simon of Cyrene, he is forced by the soldiers to carry the crossbeam of Jesus for him. Now when Mark tells that story, Mark makes this little note that he's the father of Alexander and Rufus. Like we're supposed to know who they are? Well, Mark's readers would, because what we assume is that years later, about 25 years later when Mark's writing, that those two sons became Christians, active in the church, perhaps even leaders, perhaps preachers. And that's why Mark just points out it was their father who helped Jesus carry the cross. We're told that a large crowd of people were following Jesus. In that crowd, a lot of women, and they were mourning and lamenting for him. Oh, they were not in favor of the crucifixion. They were saddened by it. Now, the path from the judgment seat to the place of execution has picked up a Latin name, the Via Dolorosa. Via Dolorosa in Latin means the way of sorrow, or we sometimes say the way of suffering. Now, if you know anything about this tradition of the way of sorrow, the way of suffering, you can see it played out if you go into an old Catholic church, those cathedrals we like to take tours of, and you see the stained glass windows. Check the stained glass windows and look for the 14 stations of the cross. Or if it's not done in the windows, look for in little icons that are around the building. You can start at one side and you work your way around in a circle, and what you'll find is it tells the story of the way of the cross, the way of the suffering, the way from the judgment to Golgotha. Now, in that, it adds more than what the Gospels tell us. To get 14 stations, you're going to add some Christian legends, which may or may not be true, of course. Now, one of the legends you'll get is the legend of Veronica, where Jesus at one point he's bleeding, he's sweating, and a woman in the crowd comes up with a towel, and she wipes his face, and when she gets done, there's the face of Jesus on that towel, and it was called the Vera icon, the true image of Jesus. And somehow or other that became the lady's name. She's Veronica. You could tell all of that's just a legend somebody made up over time. There's the story of his first fall, his second fall. The Gospels don't mention him falling, though he may very well have done so. You get my point. The 14 stations of the cross, a lot more legend than it is biblical text, but at the same time, as you look at the story, you start to appreciate, though, what a difficult trip that must have been, as Jesus step by step went the way to Calvary, carrying his cross. Now, the crucifixion site for Jesus was outside the walls of Jerusalem. Now, that was typical anyway, that you don't crucify inside the city, but rather you go out on the main highway and you put the cross on the side of the road so that people going in and out of the city will see the cross and also learn a lesson. You don't want to be messing with the laws of Rome. And so Jesus was crucified outside the city of Jerusalem. The book of Hebrews chapter 13 verse 12 says that as he was sanctified for the people through his blood, he suffered outside the gate. Now Hebrews mentions that Because he says that's what happened to the Old Testament sacrifices. They killed animals at the altar and then took their bodies outside the camp and burned them. And thus he has an invitation for us. Let's you and I go outside the camp. Let's go outside the city of Jerusalem. Let's go outside with Jesus and share with him in his shame and reproach. The world hated him. They can hate me as well if they wish, because I'm going to stand with Jesus because he was willing to stand for me. Love that spirit. In fact, that's my closing thought for you this day. If Jesus was willing to suffer and die for us, what are we willing to do for him?